Mr. Brock, let me come to you, if I could, to talk just a little bit about the FISA process. This process requires, as I understand it, either the director or the deputy director to certify every FISA application. Now, the Judiciary Committee, on which I also sit, has had Director Comey, former Director Comey, former Deputy Director McCabe up before the committee, and they have testified in effect that actually this certification process is just a formality. You know, I mean, they didn't, neither of them, they represented, they didn't really read the applications. They didn't really take it that seriously. Oh, it's just a signature on a page. Is that your understanding of what the certification process amounts to and why it's in the statute?
And not for this type of case, Senator. It would be startling to me that an FBI director and deputy director would treat a FISA application against a presidential campaign in a nonchalant way. I would assume that they, or at least their chief of staff, the chief counsel, would read it word by word and inform them to the deepest degree possible as to the nature and applicability of the FISA. If it was a normal FISA on a suspected intelligence officer of the FSB, that's one thing, fairly routine, fairly pro forma. But that's not what we're talking about here. So that it stretches credulity that they would wave it off as well. We just signed off on it as kind of in a rubber stamp manner. That just is hard to fathom.
You know, as a former leader at the Bureau, Mr. Brock, just tell me what you think about what the FISA court said when they rebuked the FBI directly and said that because of the misinformation and in one case at least outright falsehood that the Bureau submitted to that court, to the FISA court, as part of the FISA application process, because of those falsehoods and misinformation, the court can't trust the FBI submissions and other cases that have nothing to do with Crossfire Hurricane. I mean, have you ever heard of something like this happening? I mean, what does this say about the credibility of the FBI and what they have done in the Crossfire Hurricane case?
This is part of the wake of damage that's been left by these executives, because you're exactly right, Senator. It calls into question every other FBI FISA application for vitally important cases, counterterrorism cases, life and death type of investigations. So it's tremendous damage. I don't think the court was strong enough, frankly, in its condemnation of this activity. The director's own words, Director Comey's own words, that the dossier was salacious and unverified, and then 2 times after uttering those words, he signed off on a FISA application that was, by the FBI's own admission, by their own admission, dependent on that dossier for the probable cause. So it's difficult to square what their thinking was and why they went forward like this, other than there was an ulterior motive there somewhere.
Well, let me ask you about your testimony, your written testimony, in which you said that you're firmly of the view that there was insufficient evidence to justify opening the Crossfire Hurricane investigation. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, thank you. And I want to be clear here because obviously I'm taking a different position than what the Inspector General wrote in his report. But if you read that carefully, he interviewed Crossfire Hurricane team members, and all of them spoke about the necessity of investigating Russian interference with the election. Nobody disputes that. That is clearly an FBI responsibility. Russia always tries to interfere with elections and other parts of our government activities. Nobody is disputing that. Crossfire Hurricane was a case that was opened against U.S. citizens in members of a presidential campaign, unprecedented, never been done before. You would think it would be handled with care, marked all over that decision-making process, but it doesn't appear that way. So they literally took fourth-hand information. The FBI received information from a friendly foreign government, which we now know to be Australia, who in turn had a conversation with George Papadopoulos, who in turn received information now known through Joseph Mifsud that the Russians had suggested they had information damaging to the Clinton campaign. I'm not sure how you rally all of that together to make sufficient predication for opening even a preliminary investigation, a limited investigation. They went ahead and opened a full investigation, which gave them the ability to use all of the FBI's investigative powers against U.S. citizens. And as I pointed out earlier, not only were they relying on fourth-hand hearsay, embedded in those statements by the Australian diplomat were two exculpatory statements that should have stopped the show right then, but didn't.
Right, and we now know that the source, the Steele Dossier, which was the principal source for the FISA warrants, and we've heard testimony in the Judiciary Committee that the FISA warrants would not have issued had it not have been for the Steele Dossier, and we now know that the principal source for that was, in fact, a Russian agent. I mean, subject to a counterintelligence investigation by the FBI at the time they saw the warrants. I mean, it's just, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, if this were a movie, you'd say, oh, it's totally implausible. In fact, it's actually happened. And that's why I continue to believe this is potentially the biggest scandal in the FBI's history. Let me ask you, though, you talked about the care with which this investigation was handled. It seems like it was handled with a lot of care by a small, tight-knit group of people at FBI headquarters, spearheaded by Peter Strzok. You've also got McCabe in there very much driving this. And that's unusual, right? It's unusual for an investigation of this nature to be launched not from a field office, but at FBI headquarters from a very small group of people. I mean, just tell us about that as someone who's been part of this process before. Why was the procedure here and the initiation, why was it unusual?
Yeah, it is hard to overstate how anomalous this behavior was, that they would, first of all, open up a counterintelligence investigation into a presidential campaign without incredibly substantial justification, let alone thin. And then secondly, to embargo that investigation onto the 7th floor of the FBI and run it out of headquarters. The reason why the FBI runs its investigations in field offices is not in headquarters, because headquarters is close to the political flame of Washington, D.C. They're there for a different purpose. They're not there for an investigative purpose. The field offices handle investigations. That's where the experience is. That's where the sobriety is in making a judgment about whether there's adequate predication under the Attorney General guidelines exists. No, they took this into the 7th floor, out of the director's office, and ran this rogue investigation. And I would be willing to, and this is speculation admittedly, but I would be willing to wager that many of those executives involved in that investigation had never read the Attorney General guidelines, didn't understand them.
Well, thank you for your service, Mr. Brock, and thank you for your testimony here. And I'll just say, Mr. Chairman, I know my time has expired, but based on the testimony that this committee has collected and the extensive investigation that you and the committee have pursued and the testimony the Judiciary Committee has heard, I think it's pretty clear that there was an enormous amount of care taken in opening this investigation. And it was done for political purposes. I think it becomes increasingly clear for all the reasons Mr. Brock has outlined, the violation of procedural norms, the outright lying to the FISA court. This was done very deliberately. It was done by people who did not want Donald Trump to be president, who did not want the 2016 election results to stand, and they tried to weaponize the FBI to interfere in a presidential election. And sadly, they succeeded. And that is going to go down, I think, as one of the great disgraces in American history. And this committee and this Senate needs to make sure it never happens again. Thank you for your work on this, Mr. Chairman.